All right, everyone. All right, everyone. All right, everyone. Thank you very much for coming to Constitution Day. Constitution Day celebrates the signing of the United States Constitution on September 17th, 1787. And I'm proud to report America has made it another year. So let's give America a round of applause, right? Civic responsibility is one of the major themes throughout the Honors College curriculum. In your first year, you're exposed to the great statesmanship of Greece and Rome. In your second year, you study the American Constitution and the American founding. In your third year, you study Shakespeare's Roman plays, which deal with statesmanship in Rome. And in your fourth year, you read Alexis Tocqueville's excellent analysis of the United States, democracy in America. And so I'm very pleased that tonight's lecture complements our curriculum so well. Before I introduce our speaker this evening, I want to inform you of the next honors event. Next Friday, on September 27th, we will have Dr. Jason Baxter of Benedictine College, who will be giving a presentation on Dante entitled, "Can Poetry Save the World?" And so I would be delighted if all of you returned to hear Dr. Baxter speak of Dante. Tonight's Constitution Day lecture is Dr. David Bobb of the Bill of Rights Institute. Dr. David Bobb is a nationally recognized leader in civic education, having worked for 25 years at the intersection of civic engagement and education reform. Since 2013, he has served as the president of the Bill of Rights Institute, one of the nation's leading providers of free, open educational resources and professional learning programs for secondary school teachers of American civics and history. Since 2020, he has played an integral role in the creation and implementation of the Educating for American Democracy Roadmap, a cross-ideological, inquiry-based project that seeks to bring civics and history learning together for K-12 teachers and students. Previously, David worked for 12 years at Hillsdale College, where as founding director of the Washington, D.C.-based Kirby Center for Constitutional Studies and Citizenship, he created educational resources and programs accessed by millions of Americans. Author of Humility, an unlikely biography of America's greatest virtue, and a chapter on Frederick Douglass in a recent volume, David has written for publications including the Wall Street Journal and Fast Company, and is currently writing a book on the future of civics. Like Dr. Cook, like Dr. Williams, he received a PhD in political science from Boston College. And so please join me in giving Dr. Bobb a Royal Crusader welcome.
Well, thank you for that warm welcome. It's wonderful to be on your campus. I know I have to bring my A+ game when I'm talking to the Honors College. I promise you, even though you're getting a pocket copy of the Constitution tonight, there won't be any quizzes or tests. I may ask you a few questions. Feel free to jump right in because we're going to make this a conversation. I'm going to talk tonight about a couple of themes, and I'm really grateful to my friend and what a great job he does here for the Abbey, Professor Thomas Sferricali. Thank you so much for having me and for this opportunity. But my talk tonight is really about what is the Constitution for? Self-government and citizenship in America. So the first thing I should do is really wish you all happy Constitution Day. It was a couple days ago. We're going to talk a little bit about how that came to be, why we're marking it on September 17th. But the topic that I'd like to take up, the big question is, what's the Constitution for? Increasingly, we see in our country calls for maybe it's been a good run. Maybe nearly 250 years is about all that we have. Maybe the Constitution is kaput. In fact, the dean of Berkeley's law school, Erwin Chemerinsky, recently came out with a book just this fall that says that we have to scrap the whole thing and start again with a new constitutional convention. His book makes this claim, that this professor, quote, has come to the sobering conclusion that our nearly 250-year-old founding document can no longer hold, end quote. So I won't get into, at least in my remarks here, this particular claim, but I do want to take seriously an assessment of where we're at as Americans and where we're headed in the future, and focus particularly on the big ideas of citizenship and self-government. So think of where we're at today. I recently was reading the New York Times and came across a really interesting piece. It was about a documentary that's being done about the opioid epidemic that has plagued our country. And it profiled a young man who was at the focal point of this documentary, and he said the following, quote, "The pursuit of happiness isn't even here. It's the pursuit of survival. Then you just live. And after that, maybe there's happiness," end quote. There's a crisis of meaning, many people would argue, in this country. That people have lost their way, that there's an alienation from each other and from the country as a whole and the principles on which we were founded. What's the state of our pursuit of happiness and the attainment of it? Right now, there's also a lot of societal and cultural uncertainty. We feel increasingly uneasy around each other. Many of you are fresh off your high school experience. A recent study and survey of high school students across America found that 56% of American high school students feel comfortable disagreeing with one another and their teacher. That means that 2 out of 5 of high school students don't feel comfortable. That's not good. Here's a question for you all. If you think of any part of America, any kind of domain of our life, culturally, within civil society, is there one part of it right now that doesn't seem politicized to you? Anybody venture a guess or an idea that you have? One area of American life where you don't feel like politics has encroached there. I see a lot of shaking heads. So I've been asking everybody that I come in contact with this question, and I've heard only one cogent answer: Dolly Parton. Nobody's managed to make her a political object of contestation, and she's managed to stay out of the political realm. But otherwise, it seems like almost everything, right? Sports, religion, food, music, go down the line, that we're kind of in this hyper-political reality. Combined with that reticence that comes kind of that sense that we're walking on eggshells, we see the awareness of what political scientists call polarization. You all have lived that over the last couple of decades as we become more and more polarized. It used to be, for example, that spouses disagreed with each other more in the way that they voted. Back in the 60s, it was in the roughly 60% or so agreement. Now it's gone up to about 81% agreement. Also, kids would want to vote differently than their parents, right? They didn't They wanted to fall far from the apple tree politically. We've actually seen more kind of agreement between children and parents. Again, from the 1960s in the 60% range, mid-60s, and I think it's now somewhere hovering all the way up to 85% agreement, kid with parent. Polarization, two Stanford political scientists showed, is afflicting children as young as 11. Negative affective polarization is a fancy way to say that when you wake up in the morning, you think about who you don't like. And you're repelled by those who do things more than you're even drawn in to affinity, right? So you see whoever you identify as the other or them, and you're like, I'm not going to be that. And that's something that I loathe. At its worst, negative affective polarization can get you to the place where you might say something like, well, at least that person that I know hates the right people. That's a pretty negative way to look at the world, right? We've been more polarized in our nation's past. And in fact, if you drill down into this data, I think what you'd see is that there's actually more agreement than you realize. There's an interesting study that revealed that if we were to divide up here and we were to be a representation of the American people, sure, there'd be extremes on 10%, 12% on either end, but there'd be a lot of people in the middle that identify with what this study called the exhausted majority. That you're tired of the elites politicizing everything, you're tired of the polarization that pushes people to the edges, and you want to bust through that and actually solve stuff. So the question, in part, that we're wrestling with is our polarization as real as it seems? But the challenge here, even if we were able to get to the bottom of that conundrum, people think right now, Americans think that we're really polarized and that we're headed to a place that will be increasingly more so. Okay, so we have this pursuit of happiness problem, we have the politicization problem, we have a polarization problem. All of this has led us to wonder, where's the unum in e pluribus unum, right? We get the plurality part, we get the fact that we're a very plural people. But the question is, what unites us? Heap on top of that economic uncertainty, right? The inflation, the national debt, a daily grind where people feel like they can't get ahead, and an increasingly common belief by people in your generation whose parents say that they don't believe that you will be better off than they were. And that as you grow, and we start, pollsters and survey folks start asking you that same question, do you think that the children that you'll bring into this world, will they be better off than you? In America, we've always had that confidence. And right now, we're seeing a cratering in that number. 36% of the American people right now, according to most reliable public opinion polling, believe that the American dream is still alive and well. Now, a few years ago, The Onion had a headline that I think sums up all of this kind of quite nicely. So it's a fake headline, bear in mind. But it said, the Supreme Court decided 8-1 that the American people are unfit for self-government. While it's not a real headline, it raises a serious question. What makes a people fit? What makes them worthy of the blessings of liberty? So let's talk a little bit about the Constitution. On September 17, 1787, after nearly 4 months of deliberation in Philadelphia, 39 delegates to the Constitutional Convention signed the document. How many of you have been in that room in Philadelphia? What's now called Independence Hall? Okay. So it has a high ceiling, kind of like this room, windows that are remarkably similar. It's about, what do you think, maybe a quarter of this space. It's pretty small. For 4 months, the delegates there got together every day in an unusually hot summer with no air conditioning, windows shut like that, not open like that one, all throughout that deliberation, secret, hard, nearly every day failing, and maybe dissolving that deliberation. They stuck with it. There were lots of arguments and debates, many of which carried on deep into the night. James Madison sat where you did. George Washington sat there and gave everybody confidence that no matter what they came up with for the executive, he'd be the holder of that seat. Madison wasn't the official secretary, but took the best notes. And every night would go home and order those notes, reorder them, and re-up for the next day. He was an amazing politician. We think of him as sort of a genius of political theory, which he was, but he was also a very shrewd operator. And even as able as he was on the losing end of a majority of the votes of the major things that were contested during those 4 months. So if any of you have served on a committee or are now gearing up to serve on a committee, you know that you don't often associate the word productivity with a committee. It can be messy, it can be frustrating, you can have free riders, you feel like nothing ever gets done, and why can't we just move on and actually get something accomplished? That was an extraordinarily productive committee. When it got done, the work only started though, right? Because the handiwork, the Constitution that was sent off to the states faced a very tough ratification battle. So the first thing that they do when they get done is send it off to the states. It would have to earn the respect of the American people if it was to gain ratification. Respect would not be enough, however, to sustain free government, for in time the Constitution would have to command the reverence of the people as well. And I think the founders knew this as they were doing that long, hot summer of deliberations. One of the reasons that we know this is the letters that they would write at night by candlelight. So we have their formal record of deliberations, and you ought to read the whole thing because it's really fascinating. But at night they'd write letters. They'd write letters to their spouses, to their wives. They'd write letters to each other. They'd write letters to others. George Washington, in a letter that we discovered just a few years ago, wrote this, quote, "The happiness of this country depends much upon the deliberation of the Federal Convention, which is now sitting. It, however, can only lay the foundation. The community at large must raise the edifice." They found that letter in an attic in New Jersey. And I thought it was just a beautiful picture of what they were up to. You can lay the foundation, right? It's going to be hard, but we're going to get through this document. We're going to send it out to the people, and if we fight that fight politically and do it really well, we'll get it ratified. But the question is, are we, the people, up to the task of actually putting it into effect? Can we do the barn raising for our country? Because that's an ongoing task. It's not a one and done thing. The other founders knew Washington was right. Their handiwork produced the foundation, but citizens had to build upon it a structure that would be as solid and long-lasting as the foundation. Now, here's the thing. When you have a really beautiful building, you don't often sit around and think about how great the foundation is. Right? You look at the soaring parts of it, the beautiful parts. How do you get reverence for a foundation? This work, marked by humble craftsmanship, this foundation laying, makes possible a structure that will endure. And as an edifice rises atop a solid foundation, right, the raising that we have to do, the builders and those who will inhabit the building become more attached to it and to what's rising before them. So when the founders were laying the foundation, they were preoccupied with the question of reverence. How are future generations going to be attached to the thing that has been built? Because they knew that that attachment was not going to come the normal way in the United States of America. In the past, blood and soil could serve as the kind of uniting aspects. But they were doing something different. America was a home, to be sure, but it was also an idea. It was an experiment. As an edifice takes shape, both the builders and those who George Washington called the community at large, right? He had another phrase that he used in a lot of his letters called the millions yet unborn. Those people, we can grow to love that which is being built. So what seems to be uninspiring work, the long, arduous task of ensuring a solid constitutional foundation, turns out, in fact, to be the thing that should inspire us, inspire in us the deepest reverence. To revere something is to love it. Here, let me go to another American president, Abraham Lincoln. He gave a speech when he was about 10 years older than you all, called the Lyceum Address, and let me just quote a bit of it for you. Here I'm quoting from our 16th president. "Let reverence for the laws be breathed by every American mother to the lisping babe that prattles on her lap. Let it be taught in schools and seminaries and in colleges. Let it be written in primers, spelling books, and in almanacs. Let it be preached from the pulpit, proclaimed in legislative halls, and enforced in courts of justice." End quote. Lincoln's statement about reverence for our Declaration and Constitution and laws is really about teaching and learning first principles. That's something that's at the core of the work that you're doing in the Honors College. But think of this, right? So here you have people, they're laying a foundation. They know that they have to do this really hard thing to get people to have reverence for this thing that's just been built. How do you attach them to it? Think of how difficult that task was. So we're in 1787, right? Let's actually take a step back. Because to study the Constitution and to celebrate Constitution Day, I think requires that you go to the Declaration of Independence. So in 1776, the United States was waging a war against the imperial might of the British. Seemingly insurmountable task to win that war. Betting on the Americans would have been a long shot. Our Continental Army, right, the name of the American Army, operated on a continent, a fraction of which had even been explored. You know, Thomas Jefferson never went west of the Shenandoah Mountains. Wars of religion at this time had been the rule, not the exception, in human history. Wars of imperial conquest had also been the rule. So you're doing this thing, you're mounting this task, and you're wondering something pretty audacious, which is, can we be the exception to almost everything that has come before us? Society had never lived fully by the idea of reflection and choice, as Publius called it, rather than accident and force. Let me illustrate this. You have, all of you, courtesy of the Jack Miller Center, which is a great partner in civic education of the Bill of Rights Institute, where I work. You have the Declaration and the Constitution. If you were holding not the printed version, but the original one that Jefferson wrote, he wrote it, and you know, we don't use pens as much anymore, but for those of you who still use pens and send a note or write a letter back home, do you ever write a word then you're like, boy, I hope nobody ever sees that I just wrote that word. I'm going to cross it out and keep crossing it out, right? So Jefferson did that with one word in his draft. And for the longest time, up until about 10, 15 years ago, we didn't know what that word was. But then the Smithsonian developed some technology where they could scrape the layers back of the ink. And the word that they revealed was the word that he had referred to Americans by. I'll ask you in a second if you know what that word was. The word that he wrote over it was citizens. What word did he scribble out? Anybody know? Subjects. The audaciousness of the American experiment is to reject forever that we had to be subjects. That we were subjects to a crown, denied self-government, and denied citizenship. That's something that Jefferson, and I would suggest to you the rest of the founding generation, wanted to blot out. They weren't saying we reject all of the blessings that we've had from being part of the British Empire. In fact, in the Declaration of Independence, they talked about consanguinity, right? A common blood. And they saw that as a positive thing. There was a lot of gratitude, and it took the colonists a long time to recognize that they no longer wanted to be subjects. So they weren't revolutionaries like the Jacobins, for example, starting a new calendar. Year 1, we begin anew, right? They were recognizing that there was a patrimony, but nonetheless, they were breaking away and saying, we need to do something new. We need to live by reflection and choice, not by accident and force. What if we declared that all human beings have rights and we actually meant it? That's what the founders did in the Declaration. So there's a relationship between these two documents. Lincoln, again, is a pretty good guide here. He drew upon the book of Proverbs, and he pictured for us an apple of gold that was inside a frame of silver. And he said the Declaration of Independence is the apple of gold. You put the frame around it, right? So you get the principle that all human beings are equal, that government's job is to uphold their rights. That's the thing around which the frame goes. So what's the Constitution for? It's up to uphold what Frederick Douglass called these saving principles. I want to say a few words about Douglass, because I think he's a person that today can help address all those things that I started this talk with. That alienation that Americans feel. You might be wondering even right now, what connection do I have to this country? How am I to be united? You know, if you fast forward to July 4th, 2026, what do you imagine? Is it going to be great? You know, like we'll have an amazing fireworks display, right? It's going to be truly epic. But will we have unity? We're a nation of 330 million people, and we have all of those challenges that I talked about. The reason that I want to close with a reflection on Douglass, and then I'll tell you a couple things about the handout that you have, and then we can take your questions, is I think Douglass really understands what it means to feel alienated from America. He understands what it feels like to be kind of alone almost on his own island. Have any of you read Frederick Douglass's autobiography? He's written 3 of them. Excellent. That's great. So Douglass was, you have to, if you have not read it, you have to do it tonight, by the way. It's just too good. Go back to your dorm. It will take you several hours, but it will be well worth it. Douglass was a slave for the first nearly 20 years of his life. He characterized that time as without an intelligible beginning. He didn't know who his father was. He hardly knew his mother. One time we know that she came from a plantation 13 miles away from where he was on the eastern shore of Maryland and walked that distance only to come upon him being denied his day's rations by his slave owners. And she stood up for him. And that was the first time that anybody had ever stood up for him. And she had to walk back that same night. So he hardly saw her at all. Hardly knew her. And yet, like her, he managed to teach himself how to read. And the book that he discovered and bought with money that he had earned shining people's shoes in Baltimore taught him about freedom. And it gave him an image of what freedom could be in politics and in society. And yet he had to go back, and each day and each part of his journey deeper into the kind of dark heart of enslavement grew worse and worse. For what would happen with people who became literate, enslaved people who became literate, is that often they were sent out to be quote unquote broken. And that's what was done to Douglas. You have to read his harrowing account of what that meant. But the beatings were daily and harsh and ferocious. And what Douglas had to do was restrain himself, because by this point he was a strong teenager who could resist this man who was hired to break him. What happened? Something remarkable happened. In Douglas, I think we see somebody who discovered freedom, made it powerfully his own, and what he realized is that he could be free in his mind and heart and soul before he was free in his body. And as such, that gave him a liberty. It gave him a remarkable sense of restraint and strength. And so, having come to this kind of existential freedom, he decided one day that he was going to resist the predations of his slave breaker. And he did. And after doing so, there was a ferocious multi-hour fight. That man never touched Douglas again. But Douglas still was enslaved. It took him a while to hatch a very clever plan for his escape. He was able to do that. I won't give you the spoiler for how he did it. But he went up north, and he found his way to New York, through Massachusetts, and he became, astonishingly, one of America's best-known orators. So good was he that people challenged the very idea that he was ever an enslaved person. He said, "If you want to see my diploma, you can look on my back, for it is written there," right? The markings from his whippings. Douglas fell into a school of thought called the Garrisonian School, after William Lloyd Garrison. William Lloyd Garrison was a remarkably charismatic figure. He fought ferociously the idea and practice of human enslavement, and yet he said of the Constitution, it was a blood-soaked covenant, and he would have nothing to do with it. He didn't want to have anything to do with politics either, for he thought that was so impure and poor a practice that he only wanted to call America out to a complete and total rejection of slavery. Now, Douglas, as he grew in fame and acclaim in the United States and went around our country, went around the world lecturing, started to read back in these debates that we've talked a little bit about. He read Madison's notes on the Constitutional Convention. He read the early correspondence. He read voraciously, and what he was trying to figure out is the Constitution a pro-slavery document? Or might it be, as he came to realize, a glorious liberty document? And one day, in his own newspaper, he announced that he was breaking with the Garrisonian school and saying of the Constitution that it, in fact, was a noble compromise. And in fact, it didn't compromise away the principles of the Declaration. That's a very contentious and contested claim, even today. But that was Douglas's view. And in perhaps the greatest speech in American history, on July 5th, not 4th, 1852, in Rochester, he was wrestling with all of these ideas. You ought to read that speech too, in addition to his autobiography. What to the Slave is the 4th of July. You might have read excerpts from it from Colin Kaepernick a few years ago, because the excerpts that Colin Kaepernick tweeted out were the fiery ones when Douglas denounced the United States and said, "You," he wouldn't even say "we," right? "You have allowed this institution to fester and become the evil that it is." He was mad, and he had a reason to be angry. His was a righteous indignation. But as he comes around to the rest of this speech, the parts that you didn't see quoted as much and not tweeted at all by Colin Kaepernick, what Douglas said is this, that those principles of equality for all and liberty for all, they were saving principles. Pretty remarkable statement from a person who spent the first nearly 20 years of his life enslaved. To say that those principles laid down in the Declaration, codified in the Constitution, sought by the founding generation reverence. What Douglas is showing us is how to revere and at the same time recognize that it took a while for these principles to come into practice. And that even yet today, for our fellow Americans who feel alienated, who wonder if they should applaud when we say, well, we've made it another year under the Constitution, right? Even the law school dean at Berkeley who says we should scrap the whole thing. Isn't the message to all of them to say that what the Constitution is for, self-government, the ability to be citizens, not subjects, the ability to be active citizens. Think of that from the perspective of somebody who has just gone through a naturalization ceremony. I spent July 4th this year taking my two sons, who are 15 and 13, to Mount Vernon, George Washington's historic home, where they asked 100 individuals from 56 countries to take the oath of allegiance to the United States. It was a beautiful ceremony. At Monticello, they had 5,000 people, I hear, this year. And you know what they all talk about in their speeches when they're given the opportunity? Freedom, equality, justice, the ability to avoid eternal war over religion, to practice their faith as they would wish, the ability to pursue the American dream. That's what the Constitution is for. The realization of that in people's everyday lives. So when you're thinking about these things, when you're studying them, how many of you are doing Greece and Rome right now, your first year? Okay. And how many of you are in your second year? You're reading all of these things? Okay, great. So I won't ask for a show of hands about how many of you have read the Constitution. It can be, wow, there you go. Sure, excellent, good. You can raise your hand, that's excellent. For those of you who aren't raising your hands, go read it tonight. It's not as exciting as the Declaration, right? It doesn't have the kind of pyrotechnics. But think of it, the last thing that I'll mention is this handout that you have. It's kind of constructed like, there's a foundation here and then you go up the chain. And this was our effort at the Bill of Rights Institute, to try to explain the relationship of all of these principles. Natural rights, liberty, equality, and justice, that's your bedrock. What that allows you to do is have majority rule but minority rights, consent of the governed, right? That key idea of self-governance, and the democratic and republican features of our constitutional system. Next up, rule of law and due process. How do you obtain those things? How do you secure them? Well, you separate the powers, you institute checks and balances, and you have a very, this is often neglected in our textbooks, a system of federalism. Then you get to the question, all right, all of that structural stuff that can seem kind of boring, but is so important to the securing of what the Constitution is actually for, then you get to the debate over whether we should have a Bill of Rights or not. And that was an interesting debate where Madison and Hamilton actually were opposed to the Bill of Rights before they were for it. They worried, you know, we have all these rights because we're human beings, right? We're endowed by a creator God. We're given these rights. Government's job is to secure them. If we start writing them down, maybe people will think that it's the paper, the writing down part, that makes them operative. But we could, tonight, read the North Korean Constitution and see that it has an incredible Bill of Rights. The Soviet Union had an amazing Bill of Rights. Cuba still does today. Most nations on earth have bills of rights. But they're not much more, in a lot of parts of the world, than what James Madison called a parchment barrier, right? Just a piece of paper. So the final note that I'll leave you with is flip that over and go to the other side. If we're going to be people who, having the foundation laid long ago, right, that's still intact. We could debate that or talk about that. If we're barn raisers, you know, kind of for our national building, the virtues here are what it takes. You have the formal constitutional structure, but it's nothing really lasting unless you have the informal constitution of who we are as a people. And so my challenge to you all, as you shape and think on things of the mind, form your soul here. Let your soul be formed in such a way that you can be a citizen and not a subject. I'll stop there and look forward to taking your questions. Questions, comments, disagreement, challenge, songs? We're in a arts institution here, right? Arts building. Yes, sir.
Out of curiosity, you talked about earlier how the dean of the law school at Berkeley came out about how the Constitution should be scrapped away and rewritten as a thing. Would you say that the reason, or not the reason, but the actually, yeah, the reason why our country's kind of falling away as it is because we are moving farther and farther away from our Constitution, and not the fact that it is outdated?
Yeah, so good question. For those of you who couldn't hear, this law dean at Berkeley, Erwin Chemerinsky, who has asserted in a recent book that we should scrap the Constitution and convene a new constitutional convention and write an entirely new document. Is he right? And is it right now that our alienation from each other, all the problems that we started off thinking about tonight, are those a result? Are those sort of a feature of the founding, or are they a bug? Is that a good characterization of your question?
Yes.
Okay, so big debate, and a debate that's raging today. There's a lot of people that believe like this law professor. And their argument would go something like this. Look, 250 years is a long time. We've evolved. We have great technology now. The founders never dreamt about that. We have all kinds of things that have happened, including, a realization that, hey, it doesn't make a lot of sense for Wyoming to have the same number of senators as California. And look, the Electoral College is now routinely producing a winner who doesn't win the popular vote. These are so endemically problematic, so anti-democratic, small d, that the whole thing's got to go. The response to that would be, well, wait, have we changed that much as people? Sure, the technology is different, but it's pretty remarkable handiwork that this far after the fact, that Constitution has been the engine of more progress and more benefits to a greater number of people than probably any other ever devised. Why change up something that's been working pretty well? The counter response would be, well, look, the instrument itself is too hard to change. Since the Bill of Rights, we've only had 15 amendments and something, on the order of 10, 11, I think it's even more, like 12,000 have been proposed, right? So it's an infinitesimally small number of amendments to the Constitution that actually get adopted. The problems are too great, we got to change it. One more response, right, would be, look, human beings haven't changed at all. The founders' central insight was based on the idea that human nature is enduring. Our problems are going to change slightly in their contours, but we have to keep going back to the fundamentally same view of human nature. That, I think, is the big battle here. And that pushes you back into everything that you all are studying now, which is, what is the nature of the human person? That's why the study that you're doing of the liberal arts, it may seem sometimes, I know I had this as a student who went through a liberal arts education. Sometimes I was wondering, okay, what does this actually have to do with real life? It's okay to ask that question. It has everything to do with real life, though. As you're reading Locke and Rousseau, as you're reading Plato and Aristotle, as you're reading Nietzsche and Augustine, their argument is about the nature of what it is to be a human being. And so I'd encourage you to just anchor on that question. And a lot of these other constitutional questions flow from that fundamental big one. I hope that goes to part of what you were getting at. Yes, sir.
Yeah, you mentioned a lot about the divide.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the question is, given all of the alienation, all of the rancor, the politicization and polarization that we seem to be living through, what should the average citizen do? Good question. Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter in which he called for everyday citizenship. I think this was an interesting use of the phrase, not kind of like humdrum, but think of it. We're coming up here on an election in less than 50 days. That's something that you do at the presidential cycle only every 4 years. What do we do all the other days? That's what Jefferson wondered about. So at the Bill of Rights Institute, we teach civics, and we work with a national network of 75,000 school teachers. And so we get really practical on this very question. And what I think we need to do is think about our everyday citizenship. Think of what you can do to know, to build knowledge, to build skills, and then ultimately to develop a disposition of gratitude. You know, a country is not a family. They're not the same things. But I think gratitude is something that you can all understand in familial terms, right? You can be grateful for your mother and father or those who raised you. You can be grateful for your brothers and sisters and your more distant relatives. But you can also be annoyed by them, sometimes quite often. And you can wish to correct them But there's a sense of underlying gratitude, right, if the formation has been good. And I think what we've lost a little bit in America is that sense of gratitude as a virtue. Sometimes we think of patriotism and pride as the way to measure how we're doing. There's something to that, and it's important. But pride can teeter pretty quickly on arrogance, right? Gratitude, well honed, can help us love the things about America that are right and want to correct the things that are wrong. And so I think, to sum up, what average citizens should do is start hanging out with people that don't believe exactly like they do. So if you are the kind of person who at lunch likes a good conversation, go sit with somebody that you know you might disagree with. When you go home, talk to somebody that you know you're going to have an argument with, but figure out how to disagree better. And as a whole, what we have to do, I think, is intensely focus on the local and rekindle that sense of spirited conversation and problem solving at the local level. Because when we're all walking on these kind of eggshells, right, what we tend to do is to just hang out with people in our social media bubbles and in our human, sort of in real life existence. We tend to hang out with people that we agree with. And that is not going to be a recipe for ameliorating or helping stem the worst effects of the kind of problems that we've diagnosed. Good question. In the back there, yes? Can you stand up so that everybody can hear you, please? Yeah, so what's love of country and love of government? It's not my country right or wrong, right? That's not actually a good framing of patriotism. I think patriotism can lapse very easily into nationalism, and nationalism is a real threat. I think it's an actual problem. I think that patriotism tempered by a sense that your real love and attachment in America is to those saving principles. And you have to see them then in the embodied form. People put into practice principles. So you need to have gratitude to your fellow citizens and to those who have come before you to lay the foundation and to fight so that it might be preserved. That's why I think that gratitude and love have this interesting kind of coexistence and can help build each other up in ways that guard against the temptations to either turn on one another, right? Ideologues believe that their theories are right, and they're going to impose the theory on the reality. That's ideology. And there's ideologues of the left and right now that are stoking anger. They say they want people to be patriotic, but they're stoking anger. And you know what? That's surprisingly easy to do. But we have to build up a kind of resistance to those calls of ideology wherever they might come from. And I think the more anchored you are in local communities, and the better you are at disagreeing in an amicable way and recognizing that you don't have to be enemies after that, those are important things. Other questions? Yes?
To what extent do you feel that the Constitution is still fulfilling its purpose in America today?
I think for a document as old as it is, it's doing a remarkable job. When you think of the foresight that's required, let's think, so stand on July 4th, 2026, fast forward to that date, and then think, okay, what's life like going to be in 250 years? And then devise a framing of government that would allow for all of those possible contingencies. It's not perfect. Sometimes we think of it like the more perfect thing, that they were on their way to perfection. All they meant by more perfect really was it's better than the old one, right? It didn't imply that there was going to be a constant progression in the document any more than in us, right? Perfection is not possible. That was one thing that the founders actually believed wholeheartedly. So once you put that out of your sight and you say, politics is about, to a certain degree, muddling through, right? We wouldn't want an instrument that was super efficient. What this law professor and many people who write, these books are dime a dozen about these are the things we need to do to make a better constitution, make a new one, all this stuff, right? I'm not dismissing them. You ought to take their arguments seriously. But what they all seem to hold in common is that the mechanism of making law is the main way that we make change. And that's not actually true. There have been remarkable things that we have done through constitutional amendment. The Civil War amendments were absolutely an essential refounding of America, a doubling down on those principles and saying, we got it wrong, and now we have to get it right, okay? So I mean no dismissal or diminishment of the importance of those. But the main way that we have changed things in America is through activity through civil society. And we probably should be very careful about getting a very efficient government. Think of efficient governments in history. They're mainly efficient at wielding tyranny against the individual. If you want another book that you won't be able to put down, read One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. It's the story in one Zek, a prisoner, of what the Soviet Union meant. We don't want government to be overwhelmingly efficient. And so it runs contrary to our technological age, right? We love the efficiency and design of our smartphones, of things that move fluidly and beautifully and without friction at all. But for the founders, the friction is a feature, not a bug. And in that sense, I think our Constitution, in helping us not eliminate disagreement, but manage it, has been the singularly most effective vehicle ever designed for doing that. Yes? The book is No Democracy Lasts Forever. Was it the book by the law professor? Oh, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. Yeah. One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. If you put One Day in the Life of, and then Alexander Solzhenitsyn. We have time maybe for one more question.
My question is, what gave the founding fathers a position of authority on human rights and human nature?
Great question. So the question is, what gave the founders, the founding fathers, a position of authority on human rights? So what I think is important about the argument that I made tonight and that any argument is that not be premised on an argument from authority, right? Notice I didn't say tonight it was George Washington's excellence and James Madison's genius that means that we should believe that this thing is right. They're pointing to a North Star, the same one that Douglas looks at. And so what I think they would tell us, actually, in their own words, they say it outright, is don't invoke us, the founders, as the avatars of moral or political rectitude. Look to what we've learned from. Douglas called his newspaper the North Star, right? So what he's saying is the same thing, that same endeavor that you all are in right now, which is trying to figure out that question. What's authoritative? It's not authoritative because a scholar wrote it down. So what you're seeking here is it's authoritative because reason and revelation converge on an eternal, immutable truth. And I think the argument that they have made that is eternally, immutably true is that human beings, the human person, has duties and rights given by a creator. And the prudential correlate to that is that governments were instituted to protect those rights. And that's something that we've learned from a lot of study. And so I wouldn't point to them as the reason for this being right. I'd point to a long tradition within the West mainly that has discovered that these saving principles truly are saving.
Everyone, please join me in thanking Dr. Bobb. Now, before you go, I want to do two things. First, Dr. Bobb, I want to give you the Honors College mug, scientifically proven to make coffee taste better, and a little goodie bag of Belmont Abbey swag. All of you for coming tonight, and I do want to remind you that next Friday at noon in Grace Auditorium, we have a lecture on Dante open to the public. Hope to see you there. If you're an honors student, please make sure to sign in the back so that I know that you are here. And again, thank you very much for making Constitution Day special. Thank you, guys.